5 years after being betrayed, she returns with twins and a plan for revenge, leaving the millionaire speechless. The night was unusually silent, yet for Clara Bennett, the stillness felt deafening. The stars in the London sky seemed to mock her despair, twinkling cheerfully while her world was falling apart. She stood by the large bay window of the penthouse she once called home, gazing at the city lights, her heart heavy with emotions she could barely contain. In the background, the sound of muffled laughter and clinking glasses from the party downstairs drifted into the room. Tonight was supposed to be a celebration for Edward Grayson, her fiancé, a man she thought she knew better than anyone. Edward was the epitome of charm and success. His sharp jawline and piercing blue eyes were matched only by his sharp business acumen. The heir to the Grayson empire, he was adored by all, including Clara. But tonight, everything she believed about their love had shattered. On the table beside her lay a series of damning photos. They showed Edward with a woman Clara had never seen before, intimately close, laughing, and completely oblivious to the world. The betrayal wasn't just in the images, but in the undeniable familiarity between them, the kind that only lovers share. Clara's hands trembled as she clutched the edge of the table. Her knuckles turned white as tears streamed down her face. Unchecked, she replayed the moment she had found them in her mind. Earlier that day, she had gone to Edward's office with plans to surprise him with lunch, a rare treat in their busy lives. But the surprise had been hers. The woman was there, seated on his desk, her laughter filling the room as Edward leaned in closer than he ever had with Clara in recent weeks. The way he looked at her was what broke Clara's heart. It was the same way he once looked at her, as if she was his entire world. "Clara, you're overreacting," Edward had said when she confronted him, his voice dripping with a calmness that only made her angrier. "It's nothing, just business." "Business?" she repeated, her voice cracking with disbelief. "You don't touch someone like that for business, Edward. You don't look at them the way you looked at her." He had sighed, his expression turning cold, distant. "You don't understand how these things work, Clara. I don't owe you an explanation." That was the moment Clara realized the man she loved wasn't the person she thought he was. The Edward Grayson she had fallen for, the one who held her close during late-night walks, who whispered promises of forever, was a facade. The Edward standing before her now was calculated, indifferent, and cruel. Clara had packed her things that same evening, refusing to face the humiliation of staying under his roof any longer. Her hands moved mechanically as she folded her clothes and collected her belongings. She wanted to scream, to cry, to confront him again, but she knew it would be futile. Edward wasn't the type to change, and her pain would only amuse him now. As she closed her suitcase, she placed a hand on her stomach. A wave of nausea hit her, not just from the stress, but from the life growing inside her. She had discovered her pregnancy just a few days prior, but hadn't yet told Edward. The thought of raising their child alone was terrifying, but staying with a man who didn't respect her was a fate she refused to accept for herself and her unborn baby. The sound of approaching footsteps broke her reverie. Clara turned to see Edward leaning against the doorway, his hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. For a moment, her heart ached, hoping he would apologize, that he would fight for her to stay. Instead, he simply said, "Do what you think is best, but don't expect me to beg." His words were like a knife to her heart. Clara clenched her fists, determined not to let him see her break. "Goodbye, Edward," she said, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to spill over. She picked up her suitcase and walked out, leaving behind the life they had built together. As she descended the grand staircase and stepped into the cold night, Clara felt the weight of her decision pressing down on her, but she also felt a flicker of resolve. She would start over, far from Edward and his betrayal. She would protect her child no matter what it took. She hailed a taxi and gave the driver an address, her childhood home, a small cottage in a quiet village hours away from the city. As the car pulled away, Clara glanced back at the towering building she once called home. She felt an overwhelming mix of emotions: sadness, anger, and a budding determination. The Edward Grayson chapter of her life was over, but her story was far from finished. Little did she know, the path she was embarking on would not just be about survival. It would be about rising from the ashes, stronger than ever. And one day, when the time was right, she would face Edward again. Not as the heartbroken woman he discarded, but as someone he would never forget. The winding country road was flanked by tall oak trees, their golden leaves fluttering down in the crisp autumn breeze. Clara leaned against the taxi window, her gaze fixed on the changing landscape as the city skyline faded into the distance. She clutched her stomach protectively, as if shielding her unborn child from the emotional storm raging inside her. The farther she got from Edward and his betrayal, the more she felt the weight of the decision she had made. Starting over wouldn't be easy, but she had no choice. Hours later, the taxi pulled up to a quaint cottage nestled in a quiet village. The sight of the small, ivy-covered home brought a wave of bittersweet memories. This was where Clara had spent her childhood, a place that held echoes of laughter, love, and safety. It was a stark contrast to the cold opulence of Edward's penthouse. Her fingers hesitated on the door handle before she stepped out. She hadn't been back here in years, not since her parents had passed away, leaving the house in her care. The driver helped unload her suitcase, giving her a polite nod before driving off. Clara stood on the gravel driveway, her breath visible in the chilly air. For a moment, she felt paralyzed, unsure if she was ready to face the past while grappling with her uncertain future. But the soft kick she felt in her stomach was all the encouragement she needed. "You and me, little one," she whispered, placing her hand over her belly. "We'll figure it out." She fumbled with the keys for a moment before unlocking the door. The familiar creak of the hinges and the faint scent of lavender, a remnant of her mother's potpourri, greeted her like an old friend. The house was just as she remembered, cozy and unpretentious. The living room was filled with worn furniture, shelves lined with books and photographs that chronicled her family's life. Clara dropped her suitcase near the couch and sank into one of the armchairs, the exhaustion of the day catching up to her. The silence was overwhelming, but comforting at the same time. For the first time in weeks, she felt like she could breathe. The next morning, Clara woke to the sound of birds chirping outside her window. The sunlight streaming through the curtains bathed the room in a warm glow, a stark contrast to the cold, sterile mornings she'd grown used to in Edward's penthouse. She stretched and placed a hand on her growing belly, silently thanking the universe for giving her the strength to leave. Her first task was to make the house feel like a home again. The cottage had been locked up for years, and a thin layer of dust coated every surface. Clara tied her hair back, rolled up her sleeves, and set to work. She scrubbed the floors, aired out the rooms, and sorted through the clutter left behind by time. As she worked, she found herself smiling at old family photographs and trinkets. Each item she touched brought back memories of a simpler time, a life before Edward, and the heartache he caused. By afternoon, the cottage began to feel alive again. Clara opened the kitchen window to let in the cool autumn air and stood there for a moment, savoring the peace. Her thoughts drifted to her unborn child. She didn't know whether it would be a boy or a girl, but she was determined to give them the love and stability she had once known. Over the next few weeks, Clara settled into a routine. She found comfort in the quiet rhythms of village life, walking to the local market, chatting with the friendly shopkeepers, and spending her evenings reading by the fire. It wasn't the life she had envisioned for herself, but it was one she was learning to appreciate. However, Clara couldn't ignore the nagging thoughts of Edward that crept into her mind. Despite his betrayal, he was still the father of her child. She debated whether she should tell him about the pregnancy, but every time she considered it, she remembered the cold indifference in his eyes the night she left. How could she trust him with something so precious? One chilly afternoon, as Clara was sorting through old boxes in the attic, she came across a journal her mother had kept. Flipping through its pages, she found words of wisdom that resonated deeply with her. Strength isn't about avoiding pain. It's about finding the courage to grow from it. Clara held onto those words like a lifeline. They became her mantra, a reminder that she wasn't just surviving, she was rebuilding. Months passed and Clara's belly grew along with her determination. She started working remotely as a freelance writer, using her skills to support herself and her baby. The income wasn't much, but it was enough to get by. She also joined a local support group for single mothers, where she found a sense of camaraderie and encouragement. Sharing her story with others who had faced similar challenges made her feel less alone. One evening, as Clara sat by the fire, her hand resting on her belly, she whispered to her child, "I promise to be the best mom I can be, and one day we'll have everything we need, because I'll make sure of it." Clara's resolve was unshakable. She didn't know what the future held, but she was ready to face it head-on. She had built a new life, one free from Edward's shadow, But deep down, she knew her journey wasn't over. There was a part of her that still longed for closure, not just for herself, but for her child. As the days turned into months, Clara began to lay plans for the future. She wasn't just going to survive, she was going to thrive. And when the time was right, she would face Edward again, not as the heartbroken woman he discarded, but as someone who had found her strength, someone he would never see coming. The labor pains came early one crisp spring morning, catching Clara by surprise. She had been organizing baby clothes in the nursery, her mind occupied with the preparations for the new chapter in her life. But as the sharp, rhythmic contractions began, she realized her twins were eager to meet the world a little sooner than expected. Clara fumbled for her phone and dialed her midwife, her voice shaky but resolute. "It's time," she said, clutching her belly as another wave of pain washed over her. The midwife, a kind woman named Evelyn who had been a steady source of support throughout Clara's pregnancy, reassured her. "Stay calm, Clara. I'll meet you at the hospital. Do you have someone who can drive you?" Clara hesitated for a moment. The village she had settled in was small, and she hadn't formed many close connections beyond the friendly faces at the market and her support group. But then she remembered Mrs. Abernathy, her elderly neighbor who had always been kind. Clara called her, and within minutes the older woman was at her doorstep, her face filled with concern. "We'll get you there safely, dear," Mrs. Abernathy said, helping Clara into the car. The ride to the hospital felt both endless and fleeting, a blur of mounting pain and anticipation. Clara focused on her breathing, Evelyn's words echoing in her mind. "You're stronger than you think." By the time they arrived, Evelyn and a team of nurses were ready to receive her. They whisked Clara into the maternity ward, their calm efficiency a stark contrast to the storm of emotions swirling within her. As the hours passed, Clara clung to the thought of meeting her babies, the promise of their tiny faces and warm little bodies giving her strength. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the delivery room filled with the cries of not one, but two newborns. Tears streamed down Clara's face as the nurses placed her babies in her arms. "Congratulations," Evelyn said with a warm smile. "You have two beautiful, healthy little girls." Clara looked down at the twins, their small faces nestled against her chest. One had a head of dark curls, while the other's wisps of hair shone golden in the soft hospital light. She marveled at their perfect tiny fingers and toes, overwhelmed by the love that surged through her. "They're perfect," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "What are their names?" a nurse asked as she adjusted the blanket around the babies. Clara had spent months agonizing over names, wanting something meaningful for her daughters. She smiled through her tears as she replied. "This is Lily," she said, gesturing to the baby with dark curls. "And this is Grace." The names felt right, a reflection of the hope and strength that had carried her through the past year. Lily and Grace. They were her new beginning, her reason to keep moving forward. The next few days in the hospital were a whirlwind of sleepless nights and overwhelming joy. Clara marveled at how tiny and vulnerable her daughters were, yet how fiercely they fought for life. She watched in awe as they slept, their little faces serene, and felt a depth of love she had never known before. But beneath the joy, there was a lingering shadow. Edward's face would flash in her mind at unexpected moments. The girls had inherited features from both of them, a constant reminder of the man who had betrayed her. She knew she couldn't run from the truth forever. Someday, she would have to face him, not for herself, but for Lily and Grace. When Clara and the twins were discharged from the hospital, Evelyn helped her settle back into the cottage. The nursery, painted a soothing shade of pale blue with accents of yellow, was finally complete. Clara had poured her heart into creating a space where her daughters would feel safe and loved. As the weeks turned into months, Clara embraced her new role as a mother. Her days were filled with feeding, changing diapers, and rocking the twins to sleep. It was exhausting and challenging, but she cherished every moment. Each smile, each coo, each tiny milestone filled her with pride. Her village neighbors rallied around her, offering support and encouragement. Mrs. Abernathy would drop by with homemade meals, and the women from Clara's support group would visit with advice and companionship. Clara began to feel like she was part of a community, something she hadn't experienced in years. One evening, as she sat by the fire with the twins nestled in her arms, Clara found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had escaped the life of luxury and betrayal Edward had offered, choosing instead a path of independence and resilience. And while the road had been difficult, it had also led her to the greatest joy she had ever known. Still, Clara knew her story wasn't over. She had built a life for herself and her daughters, but a part of her longed for closure. Edward needed to know the truth, not because she wanted anything from him, but because Lily and Grace deserved to know their father, no matter how flawed he might be. And perhaps, just perhaps, Edward needed to see what he had lost. As Clara kissed her daughters' foreheads and tucked them into their cribs, she made a silent promise. She would raise them to be strong, kind, and fearless. She would protect them with everything she had, and one day, when the time was right, she would return to the life she had left behind, not as the heartbroken woman Edward had discarded, but as the mother of his children, ready to reclaim her power and tell her story. The days turned into months, and Clara settled into her new life as a single mother, with an unwavering determination to give her daughters the best upbringing possible. The small village she had chosen as her refuge became her sanctuary, a place where she could focus on raising Lily and Grace without the distractions of her past. Yet, every step forward came with its own set of challenges. Motherhood, Clara quickly realized, was a full-time job. Lily and Grace, while delightful and full of wonder, were also demanding. Sleepless nights became routine as Clara juggled midnight feedings, soothing cries, and ensuring her daughters felt comforted and loved. Some days, exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her, but the sight of her babies' tiny smiles or the sound of their giggles made every sacrifice worthwhile. The cottage, though modest, became a warm and inviting home. Clara threw herself into creating a nurturing environment for her daughters, decorating the walls with colorful illustrations of animals, and filling the bookshelves with stories she couldn't wait to read to them. She sewed curtains for their room, embroidered with little stars, and crafted handmade mobiles to hang above their cribs. Financially, things were tight. Clara had left Edward's world of wealth behind, and with it, any safety net he might have provided. She took on remote freelance work, often typing away late into the night after the twins had fallen asleep. The work was demanding, but it allowed her to stay home with Lily and Grace while still providing for them. Clara prided herself on her ability to manage on her own, even if it meant cutting corners and living frugally. Her neighbor, Mrs. Abernathy, became a surrogate grandmother to the twins, always ready with a kind word or a helping hand. "You're doing a wonderful job, dear," she would say, watching Clara juggle the twins and a growing list of responsibilities. Clara appreciated the support, though she rarely let herself lean too heavily on others. She was determined to stand on her own 2 feet, to prove to herself and the world that she was capable of raising her daughters independently. As Lily and Grace grew, their personalities began to shine through. Lily was curious and bold, always the first to crawl toward a new toy or explore a new corner of the house. Grace, on the other hand, was more reserved, content to observe her surroundings and take her time before engaging. Clara loved watching their distinct personalities emerge, marveling at how 2 babies who shared the same womb could be so different. Despite her efforts to move forward, Clara couldn't entirely escape her past. The twins bore a striking resemblance to Edward, with their shared golden hair and piercing eyes. There were moments when Clara would catch herself staring at them, her heart aching with a mixture of love and unresolved pain. Edward had no idea they existed, and while Clara had made peace with her decision to leave, she couldn't shake the thought that her daughters deserved to know their father. One evening, after the twins had been tucked into bed, Clara sat by the fireplace with a cup of tea, her mind racing. She thought about Edward and the betrayal that had driven her away. His lies had shattered her trust, but they hadn't destroyed her entirely. She had rebuilt her life from the ground up, and in doing so, she had found a strength she never knew she possessed. Yet, the question lingered. Could Edward ever atone for his actions? And would he even want to, if he knew the truth? Clara decided to channel her feelings into something productive. She began journaling, pouring her thoughts and emotions onto the pages. Writing became a form of therapy, a way to process her past and envision a future that felt true to her values. She wrote about the pain of betrayal, the joy of motherhood, and the hope that one day she might find closure. The journal entries soon turned into stories she would tell Lily and Grace as they grew older. Clara wanted her daughters to understand the importance of resilience, integrity, and self-worth. She vowed to teach them to stand tall in the face of adversity, to never settle for less than they deserved, and to always value kindness and courage. As the years went by, Clara developed a close-knit group of friends in the village. Her support group from the nearby town welcomed her warmly, offering advice and encouragement as she navigated the challenges of single motherhood. These women, many of whom had faced their own hardships, became a source of inspiration for Clara. Together, they shared stories of triumph and struggle, reminding each other that they were not alone. Clara also found solace in nature. The village was surrounded by lush forests and rolling hills, and she often took the twins on walks, pushing their stroller along the winding paths. The fresh air and scenic beauty became a balm for her soul, helping her reconnect with the strength she had always carried within her. She would point out birds and flowers to Lily and Grace, their laughter echoing through the trees as they soaked up the world around them. Through it all, Clara's love for her daughters remained her guiding light. She knew she couldn't shield them from every hardship, but she could prepare them to face life with confidence and compassion. They were her greatest accomplishment, her proof that love and resilience could overcome even the deepest wounds. But as the twins' 5th birthday approached, Clara felt a shift within herself. The past 5 years had been a time of healing and growth, but a part of her knew she couldn't keep running from her history forever. Edward might have betrayed her, but he was still Lily and Grace's father. He deserved to know the truth, even if it meant reopening old wounds. One night, as Clara tucked her daughters into bed, Lily asked a question that stopped her in her tracks. "Mommy, why don't we have a daddy like Emma does?" Clara's breath caught in her throat. She had always known this day would come, but she hadn't expected it to arrive so soon. She sat down on the edge of Lily's bed, her heart pounding. "You do have a daddy," she said carefully, her voice trembling. "He's just not with us right now." "Will we ever meet him?" Grace chimed in, her wide eyes filled with innocent curiosity. Clara hesitated, searching for the right words. "Maybe someday," she said softly, brushing a strand of hair from Grace's face. "But no matter what happens, you'll always have me, and I'll always love you more than anything in the world." As the twins drifted off to sleep, Clara made a decision. It was time to face the past, not just for herself, but for Lily and Grace. They deserved answers, and she needed to reclaim her story. The thought terrified her, but it also filled her with a quiet determination. Clara knew she was ready to take the first step toward confronting Edward and finding the closure she had been seeking for so long. Meanwhile, in the bustling cityscape Edward Calloway called home, his life seemed to be the epitome of success. His real estate empire, Calloway Enterprises, had grown exponentially in the 5 years since Clara had disappeared. Towering skyscrapers bore his name, and his portfolio included some of the most luxurious properties in the country. To the outside world, Edward was a man who had it all: wealth, influence, and a lifestyle others envied. But beneath the surface, Edward's life was far from perfect. Success, as he had learned, came at a price. Late nights in the office, endless negotiations, and the unrelenting pressure to stay ahead of the competition had turned him into a workaholic. His opulent penthouse, while lavishly furnished, felt cold and empty. The hustle and bustle of business deals couldn't drown out the silence that greeted him every night. Yet what haunted Edward most wasn't his relentless pursuit of wealth or his lack of personal connections. It was the memory of Clara. Not a day passed when he didn't think about her. The way she had looked at him with such trust and love, the way she had left without a word, and the echoing void she had left behind. The final image of her, storming out of his office with tears streaming down her face, was burned into his memory. At first, Edward had convinced himself he didn't need Clara. He had buried himself in work, thinking he could distract himself from the ache in his chest. But as the months turned into years, the facade began to crack. He found himself replaying their last conversation in his mind, dissecting every word and action. He had hurt her. Of that, he was certain. What he didn't know was why it still mattered so much. Edward's guilt was compounded by the fact that he had tried to find Clara after she left. He had hired private investigators, scoured social media, and even reached out to her closest friends, but she had vanished without a trace. It was as if she had been swallowed by the earth. Each dead end only deepened his regret, leaving him with more questions than answers. What hurt Edward most was the realization that he had failed her. He had promised to protect and cherish her, but instead, he had become the very thing she couldn't tolerate, a man consumed by power and deceit. He had let his ambition cloud his judgment, making choices that prioritized his business over their relationship. The knowledge that he had betrayed Clara's trust was a wound that refused to heal. In the rare moments when Edward allowed himself to reflect, he acknowledged that Clara had been the best thing in his life. She had seen past his wealth and status, loving him for the person he was rather than what he could offer. Her warmth, kindness, and unwavering support had been his anchor in a world that often felt superficial and hollow. Losing her had left him adrift, and no amount of success could fill the void she had left behind. Edward's relationships with others suffered as well. He had always been a guarded person, but after Clara's departure, he became even more closed off. Romantic entanglements were fleeting, and friendships were superficial. He had built walls around himself, convinced that vulnerability was a weakness, but deep down, he knew the truth. He was afraid of being hurt again. One evening, Edward found himself alone in his penthouse, nursing a glass of scotch. The city lights glittered outside his window, a stark contrast to the darkness that filled the room. He opened a drawer in his desk and pulled out a small photo frame. It was a picture of him and Clara from happier times, taken during a weekend getaway to the countryside. In the photo, Clara was laughing, her eyes sparkling with joy. Edward stared at the image, his heart heavy with longing. "I'm sorry, Clara," he whispered into the empty room. "I'm so sorry." As the years passed, Edward's remorse only grew stronger. He began to question the choices that had led him to where he was. Was all the wealth and power worth it if it came at the cost of losing the one person who had truly loved him? He had spent so much time building his empire that he had forgotten what truly mattered. Edward's closest confidant, his younger sister Eleanor, often urged him to let go of the past. "You can't change what happened, Edward," she would say during their occasional dinners, "but you can learn from it. Maybe it's time to focus on finding happiness again." Edward appreciated Eleanor's concern, but he couldn't bring himself to take her advice. Happiness felt like a distant memory, something he had once tasted but could no longer grasp. The idea of moving on felt like a betrayal of Clara, as if letting go of the pain meant letting go of her. One night, Eleanor pressed him further. "Edward, you're punishing yourself for something you can't undo. You've already paid the price for your mistakes. Maybe it's time to forgive yourself." Edward looked at his sister, his expression weary. "And what if I don't deserve forgiveness?" Eleanor sighed, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Everyone deserves a second chance, Edward. Even you." Despite her words, Edward remained trapped in his cycle of guilt and self-recrimination. He poured all his energy into his work, convincing himself that success was the only thing he could control. But no amount of accolades or achievements could silence the voice in his head that whispered of his failures. Unbeknownst to Edward, the opportunity for a second chance was closer than he realized. Clara's decision to confront her past would soon bring their worlds crashing back together, forcing him to face the consequences of his actions and giving him a chance to make amends. The question was, would he be ready to rise to the occasion, or would his guilt and fear hold him back? Edward had no way of knowing that the life he had carefully constructed was about to be upended. The return of the woman he had never stopped loving, along with the shocking revelation of the twins he had never known existed, would force him to reevaluate everything he thought he knew about himself, his priorities, and the true meaning of love and redemption. The day Clara decided to return to the city was as dramatic as the emotions swirling within her. The skyline of Edward's empire loomed before her as she drove through the bustling streets of Boston. With her twins Liam and Lily safely seated in the back of the car, Clara couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had led her to this moment. The city that had once felt like home now felt like a battlefield, and she was ready to reclaim what was hers, or at the very least, demand the answers she deserved. The twins, now 4 years old, were the spitting image of their father. Liam had Edward's sharp jawline and piercing blue eyes, while Lily bore his confident smile and unruly chestnut curls. Yet, they were undeniably their own people, filled with Clara's warmth and unyielding spirit. Watching them in the rearview mirror as they chattered about their new adventure, Clara's heart swelled with love and a pang of apprehension. Would Edward even recognize them as his children? And how would they react to meeting the man who had unknowingly shaped their lives from afar? Clara parked the car near Callaway Enterprises, its gleaming glass facade towering above the city streets. Her stomach churned as she stepped out, and helped the twins from their car seats. Clutching their small hands in hers, she walked toward the building, her resolve strengthening with every step. This was no longer about her pain or Edward's betrayal. It was about her children. They deserved the truth, and so did she. The lobby of Callaway Enterprises was as grand as she remembered. Marble floors, modern furnishings, and a massive chandelier that seemed to sparkle like Edward's carefully crafted public persona. The receptionist looked up, her professional smile faltering as she took in Clara's determined expression and the two children by her side. "Can I help you, ma'am?" the receptionist asked, her tone polite but cautious. "Yes," Clara replied, her voice steady. "I need to speak with Edward Callaway." The receptionist hesitated, glancing at the twins and then back at Clara. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," Clara said firmly, "but I believe he'll want to see me. Tell him it's Clara Bennett." The name seemed to send a ripple through the room. The receptionist's eyes widened slightly, and she reached for the phone. Clara watched as she spoke in hushed tones, likely informing Edward's assistant of the unexpected visitor. Moments later, a well-dressed young man appeared, his eyes narrowing as he approached. "Miss Bennett," he said, his tone measured. "Mr. Callaway is in a meeting. If you'd like, I can—" "He'll see me," Clara interrupted, her gaze unwavering. "Tell him it's urgent." The assistant hesitated for a moment before nodding. "This way." Clara followed him to the elevator, the twins clutching her hands tightly. Liam, always curious, peered up at her. "Mommy, who are we going to see?" "A man who's very important," Clara replied, forcing a smile. "Just stay close to me, okay?" As the elevator ascended, Clara's nerves began to fray. She had rehearsed this moment countless times in her mind, but now that it was here, doubt crept in. Would Edward dismiss her? Would he deny the children were his? And what if he tried to take them away from her? She shook off the thought. No matter what happened, she wouldn't back down. When the elevator doors opened, Clara was led into Edward's private office. The room was just as she remembered, spacious, sleek, and filled with an air of authority. Edward was standing by the window, his back to the door, engrossed in a phone call. His posture was as confident as ever, but there was a tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there before. "Mr. Callaway," the assistant said, clearing his throat, "you have a visitor." Edward turned, his brow furrowed in irritation, until his eyes landed on Clara. For a moment, he froze, the phone slipping from his hand and landing on the desk with a thud. His expression shifted from surprise to disbelief, then to something unreadable. "Clara," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Hello, Edward," she replied, her tone cool. "It's been a while." His gaze flicked to the twins, who stood wide-eyed beside her. Recognition dawned slowly, his eyes narrowing as he took in their features. He looked from Liam to Lily and then back to Clara, his face pale. Who are they?" "These," Clara said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her, "are your children." The room seemed to grow still, the air heavy with unspoken words. Edward's mouth opened as if to speak, but no sound came out. He took a step forward, his gaze fixed on the twins. "My children?" "Yes," Clara said, her chin held high. "Liam and Lily. They're 4 years old. Do the math." Edward looked at her, his eyes filled with a mix of shock, confusion, and something that resembled guilt. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Why didn't I tell you?" Clara repeated, her voice rising. "Because you broke me, Edward. You lied to me, manipulated me, and made me feel like I was nothing. I left because I couldn't stay in a world where I didn't matter. And when I found out I was pregnant, I realized I had to protect them. From you." Edward recoiled as if she had slapped him. "Clara, Don't," she said, cutting him off. "Don't you dare try to justify what you did. I'm not here for your excuses. I'm here because Liam and Lily deserve to know where they come from. They deserve to know the man who played a part in creating them." Edward's gaze shifted back to the twins, who were watching the exchange with wide, curious eyes. He knelt down, his voice trembling as he addressed them. "Hi," he said softly. I'm Edward." Lily tilted her head, her curls bouncing as she studied him. "Are you our daddy?" she asked, her voice innocent and direct. Edward's breath hitched and he glanced up at Clara, seeking her permission. She gave a small nod, her expression unreadable. Turning back to Lily, he smiled faintly. "Yes," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm your daddy." Liam stepped forward, his eyes narrowing slightly. Why didn't you come for us? He asked, his tone sharper than a 4-year-old's should be. Edward flinched, struggling to find the right words. I didn't know, he said honestly, but I promise, I'm here now. Clara watched the exchange, her heart aching for her children. This was the moment she had dreaded and hoped for all at once. Their father, finally meeting them. She could see the genuine emotion in Edward's eyes, but she wasn't ready to let her guard down. There was still so much they needed to address. "This isn't over, Edward," Clara said, her voice firm. "You have a lot to answer for." Edward stood, his gaze locking with hers. "I know," he said, his voice steady, "and I'll do whatever it takes to make things right." The confrontation had only just begun, and the stakes were higher than ever. Clara had returned not just to seek answers, but to reclaim her power, and she wasn't leaving without it. Edward sat at his desk, his usually sharp demeanor replaced with a look of utter shock and vulnerability. The sight of Clara, standing so confidently with their twins, had rattled him in a way he never thought possible. His mind raced to process the reality of the situation. 4 years, and he had no idea he had children. Guilt and anger twisted inside him like a storm, but the most pressing question hung in the air. Why had Clara hidden them from him? Clara stood before him, her arms crossed protectively over her chest. Her posture screamed defiance, but Edward could see the hurt in her eyes. It mirrored the pain that he himself felt. This wasn't how he had imagined seeing her again. Not that he had allowed himself to imagine it at all. He'd buried his emotions after she left, focusing solely on his business and his growing empire. Now, the past had burst through the doors of his office, demanding to be reckoned with. "Sit down, Edward," Clara said, her voice cutting through the heavy silence. "We need to talk." He nodded, gesturing to the plush leather chair across from his desk. She sat, her posture as poised as ever, the twins quietly playing with a small set of crayons Clara had brought along. Their innocent chatter was a jarring contrast to the tension in the room. "Why didn't you tell me?" Edward asked, his voice low and measured. He hated how small he sounded, how vulnerable. "Why did you keep them from me?" Clara's eyes flared with anger. "Why didn't I tell you? Are you seriously asking me that, Edward? After everything you did, after you destroyed my trust, made me question my worth and left me feeling like I had no one to turn to. I never meant to hurt you," Edward said, his voice breaking slightly. "You have to know that." "Oh, really?" Clara shot back, her voice laced with sarcasm. "What about the nights I spent crying myself to sleep, wondering why I wasn't enough for you? Why you were so willing to throw away everything we had for the sake of your business deals and your selfish desires?" Edward flinched at her words. He couldn't deny the truth in them. Back then his ambition had blinded him, and his choices had driven her away. He had been a man consumed by his own ego, too caught up in his image to realize the cost of his actions. "I thought I was protecting you," he admitted after a long pause. "From my world, my mistakes. But I see now that all I did was push you away." Clara laughed bitterly. "Protecting me? Is that what you call lying and manipulating? You didn't protect me, Edward. You broke me." Edward looked down, the weight of her words crushing him. He had always prided himself on being in control, on being able to fix any problem with enough money or power. But here, with Clara, there was no quick fix. No amount of wealth could undo the damage he had caused. "What do you want from me?" he asked quietly. "Why are you here now?" Clara hesitated, her resolve wavering for just a moment. "I didn't come here for revenge, Edward. I came here because our children deserve the truth. They deserve to know their father. And you," she paused, her voice trembling slightly, "you deserve to face what you've done." He nodded slowly, his eyes flicking to the twins. Liam was now carefully coloring within the lines, his expression serious, while Lily hummed softly to herself as she scribbled on her page. They were beautiful, and Edward felt a pang of regret so deep it almost took his breath away. "They're incredible," he said softly. "You've done an amazing job, Clara." Clara's expression softened, but only slightly. "I didn't do it alone. My family, my friends, they were there for me when you weren't." Edward felt the sting of her words, but he didn't fight back. He didn't have the right to. "I want to be a part of their lives," he said, his voice filled with determination. "I want to know them, to be there for them." Clara's eyes narrowed. "You can't just waltz in and play the doting father, Edward. It doesn't work like that. You need to earn their trust. And mine. He nodded, understanding the weight of her challenge. I will. Whatever it takes, Clara, I'll do it. I'll prove to you that I've changed. Words mean nothing to me, Edward, she said, her voice cold. I've heard it all before. You want to be in their lives? Fine. But this isn't about you and me. It's about them. If you hurt them, if you so much as make them feel half of what I felt, I won't hesitate to cut you out of their lives. Her words hit him like a punch to the gut, but he knew she was right. He had to tread carefully, to prove himself not just to Clara but to the children he had only just met. Where do we go from here? He asked, his voice almost a whisper. Clara stood, her gaze unwavering. That's up to you, Edward. I'll give you a chance, but only one. Don't waste it. As she turned to leave, the twins ran up to her, their small hands clutching hers. Edward watched them go, his heart aching with a mix of regret and hope. For the first time in years, he realized that the empire he had built, the wealth he had amassed, meant nothing without the people who mattered most. This was his reckoning, and he was determined to rise to the challenge. The Cortez mansion, usually a symbol of Edward's success, now felt more like a fortress of isolation. The opulent rooms, adorned with priceless art and elegant furnishings, seemed cold and lifeless compared to the vibrant presence of his twins and Clara. Edward knew this was his opportunity to reclaim the family he had lost, but he also understood it would require more than just promises. It would demand action, patience, and a level of vulnerability he had avoided his entire life. That evening, Edward sat in his study, his thoughts racing. He reviewed the photos Clara had left behind, images of Liam and Lily growing up, celebrating birthdays, playing at the park, and even their first day of school. Each photo was a stark reminder of the milestones he had missed. It was both a gift and a curse, showing him the beautiful moments he had been excluded from, but also giving him a glimpse into the lives he desperately wanted to be part of. The next morning, Edward called his assistant Hannah into his office. "Cancel all my meetings for the week," he instructed. Hannah's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "All of them, sir?" "Yes, and clear my weekend schedule too," Edward said firmly. "I have something far more important to focus on." This shift in priorities sent ripples through his company. Edward had built his empire by being relentless and unyielding, and his sudden absence sparked curiosity and concern among his staff. But Edward didn't care about appearances anymore. His sole focus was on proving to Clara and his children that he was capable of change. Edward's first attempt to connect with his children came in the form of a visit to Clara's home. It was a modest but warm space, filled with the kind of love and personality that his mansion sorely lacked. Clara greeted him cautiously, her guard still firmly in place. "I didn't think you'd show up," she admitted as she opened the door. "I told you I'd try," Edward replied, his tone earnest. "And I meant it." Liam and Lily peeked out from behind Clara, their eyes wide with curiosity. Edward crouched to their level, offering them a warm smile. "Hi, Liam. Hi, Lily. I brought something for you." From behind his back, Edward revealed two small gifts, a set of building blocks for Liam and a sketchbook with colored pencils for Lily. The twins' faces lit up, and they hesitated only a moment before running to grab their new toys. Their laughter filled the room as they tore into the packages, and for the first time, Edward felt a glimmer of hope. Clara watched from the doorway, her expression unreadable. "Don't think this means you've won me over," she said softly. Edward nodded. "I don't expect to. Not yet." Over the next few weeks, Edward dedicated himself to earning his children's trust. He started small, joining them for play dates at the park and reading them bedtime stories. At first, the twins were shy and reserved, but Edward's persistence paid off. He discovered that Liam loved building intricate structures, and that Lily had a vivid imagination, often creating elaborate stories to go with her drawings. One afternoon, while Clara was in the kitchen preparing snacks, Edward sat with Liam and Lily in the living room. Liam was focused on constructing a towering castle with his building blocks, while Lily worked on a colorful drawing of their family. "Daddy, can you help me with this part?" Liam asked, holding up a particularly tricky piece. Edward's heart swelled at the word Daddy. It was the first time Liam had called him that, and it felt like a small but significant victory. "Of course, buddy," Edward replied, kneeling beside him to help stabilize the structure. Meanwhile, Lily held up her drawing proudly. "Look, Daddy, it's us at the beach." Edward examined the picture, his eyes lingering on the figures she had drawn. There he was, holding hands with Liam and Lily, while Clara stood nearby, smiling. It was a simple image, but it carried a profound weight. For the first time, Edward felt like he was truly part of their family. While Edward's bond with the twins grew stronger, his relationship with Clara remained strained. She was polite but distant, her walls still firmly in place. Edward knew he had to address the pain he had caused her, if he wanted any chance of earning her forgiveness. One evening, after putting the twins to bed, Edward found Clara sitting on the porch, a mug of tea in her hands. The moonlight highlighted the exhaustion on her face, but there was also a quiet strength in her posture. "Mind if I join you?" Edward asked hesitantly. Clara shrugged. "It's your porch too, technically." He sat beside her, the silence stretching between them like a chasm. Finally he spoke. "I know I hurt you, Clara, and I know I can't undo the past, but I want to make things right." Clara stared into her tea, her voice low but firm. "Do you even know what making things right means, Edward? It's not just about being here now. It's about proving that you won't disappear the moment things get hard. It's about showing me that you've truly changed." "I know," Edward said, his voice heavy with emotion. "And I will. I'll prove it to you every single day for as long as it takes." Clara finally looked at him, her eyes searching his for any sign of deception. What she saw there surprised her. Raw, unfiltered sincerity. "You've got a long way to go, Edward," she said softly, "but I'll give you a chance." Determined to build a better future for his family, Edward began making changes in his life. He reduced his workload, delegating more responsibilities to his trusted executives, and spent his mornings helping Clara with the twins' routines. He even started attending therapy sessions to confront his past mistakes and learn how to be a better partner and father. One day, Edward surprised Clara with a proposal, not for marriage, but for a new home. He had found a cozy, family-friendly house near the twins' school and offered it as a fresh start for all of them. "I don't want this to feel like I'm buying my way back into your life," Edward explained. "I just want to give Liam and Lily the stability they deserve. And if you're willing, I'd like to build that stability with you." Clara hesitated, torn between her lingering doubts and the genuine effort Edward was making. She could see the changes in him, the way he prioritized the twins and treated her with respect. Slowly, her walls began to crack. The journey was far from over, but Edward was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. For the first time in years, he felt hopeful, not just for himself, but for the family he was determined to rebuild. Edward had spent weeks rebuilding his relationship with Clara and the twins, but the past remained a lingering shadow. His betrayal of Clara wasn't just a personal failing, it had been a public spectacle. His board members, business associates, and even some close friends had supported his decision to end his relationship with her. Many of them had whispered doubts into his ear, sowing seeds of mistrust that eventually blossomed into his cold rejection of the woman he had loved. To truly prove to Clara that he had changed, Edward needed to confront those who had played a role in tearing them apart. Edward composed a carefully worded invitation to a dinner party at the mansion, addressing it to key members of his board and a handful of influential allies from his past. He chose his words meticulously, making it clear that the evening was not about business but about redemption. Once the invitations were sent, he called Clara to the study. She entered cautiously, her brows furrowed as she noticed the serious expression on his face. "I've invited some people to the house for dinner," Edward began. "The ones who encouraged me to let you go." Clara's eyes widened in surprise. "Why would you do that?" "Because I need them to see the truth," Edward replied, his voice steady. "And I need you to hear it from me, publicly. I want them to know that I was wrong and that I'm ashamed of what I did." Clara crossed her arms, her expression unreadable. "You think a dinner party can erase what happened?" "No," Edward admitted, "but it's a start. I want them to see the woman I betrayed, the strong, capable mother of my children, and I want to apologize to you, in front of the people who thought you were disposable." Clara's gaze softened slightly, though her tone remained cautious. "This isn't just about proving something to them, is it?" Edward shook his head. "It's about proving something to you." The night of the dinner arrived, and the mansion was transformed into an elegant setting, complete with warm lighting, exquisite floral arrangements, and a carefully curated menu. Clara, dressed in a simple yet stunning gown, looked every bit the poised, confident woman Edward had fallen in love with years ago. The twins were excited but nervous about meeting so many new people. Edward had explained that the evening was important for their family, though he spared them the full details. Liam clung to his father's hand as guests began to arrive, while Lily stayed close to Clara, her sketchbook tucked under her arm. The guests trickled in, each one greeted by Edward personally. There were polite smiles and curious glances as they noticed Clara standing beside him, her presence a clear signal that this evening would not be business as usual. Once everyone was seated in the grand dining room, Edward stood to make his speech. He glanced at Clara, who gave him a small nod of encouragement. "Thank you all for coming tonight," Edward began, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "This isn't a typical dinner for us. In fact, it's probably the most important gathering I've ever hosted." He paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. "A few years ago, I made a terrible mistake. I allowed fear and pride to cloud my judgment, and I listened to voices that told me to abandon someone I loved because they didn't fit the mold of what my life was supposed to look like." Edward's gaze swept over the table, lingering on each guest. "Some of you sitting here tonight were those voices, and while the blame ultimately lies with me, I've come to realize that the advice I took, the belief that Clara was a liability rather than an asset, was not only wrong, but cruel." Clara shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her cheeks flushing as the room fell silent. "Clara," Edward said, turning to her, "I owe you a public apology. I betrayed your trust. I chose wealth and image over love, and I turned my back on you when you needed me most. I can't change the past, but I can take responsibility for it, and I want everyone here to know that I am deeply sorry." The room remained silent, the weight of Edward's words hanging heavily in the air. For a moment, Clara said nothing. The guests watched her expectantly, their expressions ranging from discomfort to curiosity. Finally, she stood, her voice calm but firm. "I appreciate your apology, Edward," Clara said, meeting his gaze. "But I need everyone here to understand something. I didn't come back into Edward's life to humiliate him or to seek revenge. I came back because my children deserve to know their father." She glanced at Liam and Lily, who were sitting quietly at the children's table nearby. "Edward has made mistakes, and so have I. But what matters now is how we move forward for them." Her words were met with a murmur of approval from some of the guests, though a few remained quiet, their expressions unreadable. After the dinner, Edward and Clara found a quiet moment on the balcony, away from the guests. The city lights twinkled in the distance, a reminder of the world that had once seemed so important to Edward, but now felt insignificant compared to the family he was trying to rebuild. "That was brave," Clara said softly, leaning against the railing. "Putting yourself out there like that." "It was the least I could do," Edward replied. "I wanted you to know that I'm serious about changing." Clara studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she said, "You've taken the first step, Edward, but this is a marathon, not a sprint." "I'm ready," he said, his voice steady. "For the marathon." As the evening drew to a close, Edward felt a sense of relief. He knew there was still a long way to go, but for the first time he felt like he was on the right path. He had confronted his past, apologized publicly to Clara, and made it clear that he was committed to rebuilding their family. Now it was up to him to follow through on his promises, step by step. For Clara, the dinner marked a turning point. While she still harbored doubts, she couldn't deny the sincerity in Edward's actions. She saw a man who was finally willing to confront his flaws and fight for the people he loved. A man she might one day be able to trust again. The morning after the dinner party dawned with a sense of quiet hope that neither Edward nor Clara had experienced in years. The mansion, usually silent in the early hours, was alive with the sounds of children's laughter as Liam and Lily played in the garden. Edward watched them from the balcony, his coffee growing cold in his hands as he reflected on the events of the night before. Clara joined him, her presence so natural now that he almost didn't hear her approach. She was dressed casually, her hair loosely tied back, but her expression carried the same guarded strength that had captivated him all over again. For a moment they stood in silence, the distant sound of the children's giggles filling the air. "You did well last night," Clara said, finally breaking the quiet. "You faced them, and that wasn't easy." Edward set his coffee down, turning to face her. "It wasn't enough, though. I know that. Words only mean so much." Clara studied him, her eyes softening slightly. It's not about grand gestures, Edward. It's about consistency. The little things you do every day to show that you mean what you say. I want to do better, Edward said, his voice low but firm. Not just for Liam and Lily, but for you. I've spent too much of my life hiding behind excuses and pride. I don't want to be that man anymore. Clara's gaze lingered on him, searching for the sincerity behind his words. It's going to take time, she said, and patience. Are you ready for that? Edward nodded. I am. Their conversation was interrupted by Liam and Lily racing up the stairs to the balcony, their faces flushed with excitement. Liam held out a small bouquet of wildflowers, his grin wide. We picked these for you, Mom, he announced, thrusting the flowers into Clara's hands. Clara knelt down, her smile radiant as she accepted the flowers. Thank you, sweetheart. They're beautiful. Dad helped us find the prettiest ones, Lily added, her voice full of pride. Edward met Clara's gaze over the children's heads, a small but meaningful connection passing between them. It was moments like this, simple, unplanned, and filled with genuine joy, that reminded them both of what truly mattered. As the day unfolded, Edward found himself drawn more deeply into the rhythms of family life. He joined the twins for a game of soccer in the garden, his laughter blending with theirs as they played. Clara watched from a distance, her heart a mix of hope and caution. She wanted to believe that this Edward, the man who smiled so easily and cared so deeply, was here to stay, but she knew the scars of the past wouldn't heal overnight. Later that evening, as the children settled into bed, Edward approached Clara in the living room. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting warm shadows across the room. I've been thinking about something, he said, sitting beside her on the couch. Clara raised an eyebrow, curious. What is it? I want to step back from the company, Edward said, surprising her. At least for a while. I've spent so many years letting it consume me, and it cost me more than I realized. I want to focus on us, on being a father and figuring out how to be the man you and the kids deserve. Clara was silent for a moment, her emotions a mixture of shock and admiration. That's a big decision, she said finally. Are you sure you're ready for that? Edward nodded. I've never been more certain of anything. I don't want to look back on my life and regret the time I didn't spend with the people who matter most. Clara's eyes softened, and for the first time in years she felt a flicker of genuine trust. It's a start, she said, her voice quiet, but it's a good one. The weeks that followed were a period of quiet rebuilding. Edward kept his promise, gradually stepping back from the daily grind of his company to spend more time with his family. He attended Liam and Lily's school events, helped with homework, and even learned how to cook a few of their favorite meals. Clara watched his efforts with cautious optimism, her walls slowly beginning to come down. One afternoon, as they walked through the park with the twins, Edward reached for Clara's hand. She hesitated for a moment before intertwining her fingers with his. The gesture was simple, but it spoke volumes. You're really trying, Clara said, her voice filled with a mix of disbelief and gratitude. I am, Edward replied, because you're worth it. All of you. The journey ahead was far from over, but for the first time in years, Clara felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps, just perhaps, the man who had once broken her heart could be the one to heal it. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more heartfelt tales of love, redemption, and second chances. Your support means the world to us. Like, comment, and share your thoughts below. Stay tuned for the next chapter of Unforgettable Stories. Forgettable Stories.